Hi, welcome back to AP Human Geography. I hope many of you were with us yesterday when we took the timed sample questions, and today we're going to hopefully answer some of your questions. So let's go ahead and switch my screen over. We're nearing the end of this. I'm not going to lie, it's one of the last few presentations that I'm going to create, and I was a little bit choked up today when I uploaded it. For those of you that were able to join us yesterday, my name is Kristen Brandt. I'm from Glenbard West High School in Glen Ellen, Illinois. And those of you that are here in Illinois, you know that it has pretty much rained all day long. And so you also know I need to make some connection to something. And so let's see if you can pick this one. Just keep swimming, just keep swimming, swimming. Hopefully you picked up Finding Nemo. But that's kind of what I feel like right now. And I'm sure you feel a little bit too. Let's just keep it going. That sometimes it's kind of how do you keep moving forward? You guys are so near the end. 1 week from today, you're going to take this test, and we know you can do it. So let's see if we can give you a few more tools or tricks in your toolbox. So today, though, we're going to review some task verbs. We want to make sure that you understand exactly what these questions are asking you to do. Not necessarily, some of it's the content, but some it's more also about what we're asking you to do. And so things such as when we talk about describe, it is more than just define. And I'm going to show you some samples today where people are able to actually put in some relevant characteristics of that topic, but some that just lean more heavily on the definition. And so it's going to be adding in those characteristics that are going to get you the points. The other thing, when we talk about compare, a description or explanation, we really want to make sure you're looking at, if it's comparing, there's at least two things, right? But we're trying to pull out those similarities, those differences, that you're really trying to make those connections. And then explain, I think you're going to hear me talk a lot about kind of closing the answer. And so having some examples, and I will tell you that my students are really good at saying, this is what it is, and it's because this, but they forget to kind of close it. And I'm going to explain to you later what I mean by that. Oh, funny, explain. But here we go. The other thing, I do need to put out a disclaimer. Okay, so this is not, I'm going to call this like a scoring guide. In other words, I'm guiding you through some suggested answers, but I need you to know that these responses are not endorsed by College Board. And this is not an official rubric. So some of you right now are probably going, then why are we even paying attention? Well, let me explain to you a couple different things. So first of all, coming up with questions and your rubrics that your teachers have used with you for out the school year takes a really long time, and there's a huge vetting process that goes through. And you probably have seen sometimes, I've gotten a few emails, they're like, well, what about this answer? What about this answer? Because there's a lot of different ways that you can answer some of our questions. So obviously there's probably more answers than even what I'm sharing with you here. I'm trying to pull out some of the most common things that I think students would answer, and you're going to even see on one that I hadn't thought about it, and how that would probably, I'll walk you through how that would probably get handled at a read. But again, I just need you to know that this is a very tenuous process. Miss Lindsay and I both looked over these suggested answers, and we're very comfortable with what we're going to share with you, but these are not endorsed by College Board. It's not an official rubric. Miss Lindsay on Thursday can explain a little bit more to you about that process. So we're going to just jump right in. And what we're going to do, so this is to refresh your memory. We did question number 1. I'm not going to lie, it was kind of strange to just sit here and not talk. Those of you that have been with me the whole time know that I talk for like 45, 50 minutes. And so to just sit there was pretty tough. But you did a lot of writing. And so you really were tackling these 5 prompts here. I want to point out something to you, because I had some of my own students answer some questions. And so that we could have some student samples today. And question A and B, I'm going to tell you, have you look at them really carefully right now. What do you notice about question A and B versus C, D, and E? There's something missing. Take a look at the end of C, D, and E. Nigeria, Spain, Spain and Nigeria. Now what's missing from A and B? So for A and B, I think, and my students were guilty of this too, they focused really on the maps that you see here. What I'm challenging you, make sure you know what the question's asking. And it's okay if you did that, but you're not limited to that if it doesn't say it. So you could have talked about describing how devolution has influenced contemporary political boundaries someplace else. It didn't have to tie to those. So just really make sure that you're looking at that prompt to understand. And let's dive in and let's kind of spend a little more time with it. So for example, Question A, describe how devolution has influenced contemporary political boundaries. So when we talk about describe, remember we're looking for those characteristics. We need more. So the definition, you're going to talk about that transfer of power from local regions potentially allows for boundaries to align. That's just the starting point. We need those characteristics. And so what we're talking about, align, this is where the characteristics are going to come in. So you could have ethnic, you could have cultural, you could do some regional autonomy. I kind of put this in my geographic, you know, because of the distance from the political center. So you can see here that these would be some specific examples that you could use that are not necessarily reflected on that map, but they definitely can talk about how devolution has influenced contemporary boundaries. You know, I think my students definitely would hone in on probably Scotland or Ireland. We've talked a lot about Quebec in my class as well. So they'd probably be pulled to those areas. If you're from Canada, I mean, obviously Quebec, but none of it would probably be something that would jump out. So just remember, read the question. And if it's not asking for something that's specific from there, feel free to use examples or characteristics from outside of that area. Now, the two student samples that I'm going to show you, though, really focused on those maps. And so let's just take a minute and we'll look at some student samples. Okay, and so I'm not, other disclaimer, I'm not saying that these are perfect in any way. In fact, I'm going to show you that I think are a little bit weak. But we're going to go through and just to get some ideas on how people might have answered these questions. So it would take a long time for me to read this to you. I'm going to just pause for just a few seconds for you to kind of skim the student's answer, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. So where I struggled a little bit when it gets into the middle where it says, for example, you know, in Spain, there were no other political boundaries because Spain was under one government. I struggle a little bit there with that answer only because, you know, that would be saying, for example, that we have no other political boundaries here either. But I would say, you know, that idea of when you're moving down to those new political boundaries, this one I would say starts out really strong, but it might be better if they could bring in how are those characteristics recognized. So these, you know, coming down to where it talks about the Basque and Catalonia. So maybe talking a little bit more about their ethnic or their cultural connections that would help to define that pull for new political boundaries. Okay, I'll give you a second here to read this one. So I would say that, again, they get the right idea. But I think, you know, that they have no political advantage but want to become their own state. Gets a little bit tricky here, you know, that why would they want to become their own state? What does this area have? You know, and if you know anything, Catalonia, you know, your own language, they are economically functioning really well. They're very industrialized. And so that those political boundaries, though, so describe how devolution has influenced contemporary political boundaries, that need for independence. And so they have voted a couple times would make that a little bit stronger, but connecting it back to those characteristics would be better. And then the last example, and I don't have 3 for every single one of them, but this one I wanted to just point out because I think this is a common misconception with students. And I hope you caught it kind of right away. Devolution doesn't always lead to balkanization. Okay, devolution is really our attempt to sometimes try and stop balkanization. And so I think I would just be really careful, you know, make sure you understand, go back to the question. So how has devolution impacted contemporary political boundaries? In other words, that idea of Northern Ireland, part of the UK, Scotland, you know, part of like understanding that Quebec, you know, that yes, we have those language, those differences, maybe giving more voice politically, but the political boundaries still align with Canada or still align with the UK. Okay, and so I'd be really caution on that last answer. Okay, we're going to move to B. So explain how ethnic nationalism contributes to devolutionary pressures within a country. So this is what I was talking about earlier, okay? And so you gotta here relate ethnic nationalism to devolutionary pressures. And so that idea, what happens a lot of times is students will give us examples and they'll talk about how it's ethnic nationalism, but you've got to explain how that relates to devolutionary pressures, okay? And so that's when we talk about provide a solid example and then close the answer. In other words, bring it home. So how it, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So we talk about ethnic nationalism when people of all one ethnicity live in that same area, their wants and their needs, everything aligns, right? So that's going to give them more voice, more representation. So that's the first part, kind of understanding it. But then look at here's some examples. Okay, it wouldn't be enough. Let's go back to Quebec where I mentioned French and English to just say, okay, so for example, in Quebec, if we redrew the lines and everybody that was French lived there, okay, how does that contribute to devolutionary pressures? So what you want to say is that, for example, in a bilingual country such as Quebec, that it by allowing areas where we see more French-speaking population, more voice, that they're going to at least feel represented and balanced out versus the other areas of Canada that are English-speaking. Because remember, there's that huge concentration of French-speaking population over on the east side of Canada. And so it's this whole idea of connecting it back to contributing to that want of devolutionary, like wanting more voice, but you got to say it. Don't assume that the reader knows what you're talking about. That is my students do that to me all the time. And those that are listening, I'm so sorry, but you know I'm right. Okay, so when we look at the first example, I'll give you a second. Take a look. So I actually struggled with this one, and this was a real answer. And so I'm so grateful for these students for helping, because I don't really think that this, that causing the sector to break apart from the rest. I feel that this is a very generic, first of all, I think they're kind of ended up down the wrong path and focusing more on balkanization. And so I'm not sure this one would receive points because it's almost, it also doesn't really have an example. It's pretty generic. And so my guess is some of you might have even had an answer like that. And it's okay if you have one every once in a while. Don't panic. Our goal is how do we keep building in? So I think if you're really trying to express an idea, bring those examples in. Okay, I'm going to give you a second to read this. Okay, and I think this one did a pretty good job at closing that answer, right? Bringing it back. So they're going to talk about how ethnic nationalism, so they go in the middle and they're really talking about different dialect. They're talking about pride, for their ethnicity. So I think that's wonderful, right? That's going to explain how that contributes then, but they close it by at the end is really explaining it, but then believing that ability to govern themselves is going to increase that pressure of devolution in Spain. That's the key where they're closing it, how they tie it back. I'm sure your teachers talk to you all the time. We talk about it in social studies when we're writing, right? That you got to connect it back. You got to connect it back. And that's really what explain is asking you to do. Okay, so I'll give you a second here to read again. So I do feel at the heart of this one really starts to understand it. I know the sentence at the end kind of could be misleading, but they said it could. And so I think that that's really that it's true. I mean, if they don't have enough voice, if they're totally feeling separated, I mean, these areas we know have voted for some independence, it just they haven't separated. So I think that word could is really, really powerful there. And I think that they do actually get into, really being specific about that heart, that heartland of their culture, their unique language and way of life. Okay, so let's look at C. Explain how one regional economic difference contributes to the devolutionary pressures within Nigeria. So now you do need to be specific to these images, okay, or to these maps that you had in front of you. In other words, we do need to talk about Nigeria. And so the task verb, remember, we've got to connect and close the answer. We got to connect economic differences and devolutionary pressures. So these were just some original ones that we were kind of brainstorming. If you know, and I know that it's not on the map, but you might know oil, but even talking about uneven distribution of resources. So those ethnic regions wanting more power or say due to their abundance or lack of resources. You could talk about that Niger River Delta region. You know, islands of development, I know, is not part of, you know, not all of you might have been exposed to that, but that idea of maybe you don't use that phrase, but you know, those areas where we concentrate all of the resources or economics, they may be way more established, and so they're going to believe that they should have more power or say due to their positions of trade. Or how about in some of those areas where we see farmers or nomadic herders in that Northeast, you know, the competition for land, you know, that this is our land, we deserve to have a voice and a vote. But notice how I'm talking about some economic features, but I'm always kind of tying it back to that voice, that devolutionary practice. And so let's look at some student samples. Okay, so here's one, and I'll give you a second, so I'll stop talking for a second. Okay, I do feel like they do a nice job at the end, you know, especially where they're talking about wanting more economic opportunities. Remember, it's not necessarily talking about separated, but that idea of more voice, more opportunity. I do think that they could have talked about things that could have strengthened it, you know, talking about centralizing the resources in the city, centralizing, and maybe even naming the city as well. But I think those would strengthen it. But I do feel that this one is definitely dancing around those ideas. So the more specific that you can even pull from the map or talking about those idea of maybe even generically resources by pooling those resources together would strengthen this one. And this one's pretty long. So I'm going to let you read this and read this one carefully. I'll shut up for a second. So maybe you didn't finish it, but you get some ideas. And what you might have said is, hey, Mrs. Brandt, that wasn't on the guides that you gave us earlier. But that sounds pretty good, right? That seems like a logical reason. So this is the type of thing that I would say when I've read before that I would kick to my table leader and say, hey, I know it's not necessarily in this list, but let's think about it. Let's look through it. And so I would say that this is one where that's something I hadn't considered. In fact, I did a little bit of digging and went, this actually is a pretty good answer based off of stuff that I quickly researched. And I would say that the student definitely closed the gap on this. And so really brought it home that I just need you to know that keep explaining, like look at the nice job that the student does, really explaining the differences between these regions and why they might want that voice. It's a great answer. Okay, so question D, I love physical geography. And what we want to talk about, the territorial size contribute to those pressures as well. And so understanding, remember, we've got to talk about those, but why would that, I know you're sick of me saying it, but that's okay. Continue to tie it back to how does it contribute to those devolutionary pressures? So in Spain, we might focus, so we're focusing particularly here. And so the reason we separated these two out is when we talk about in particular the Basque and the Catalonia region is that we talk about their size, that they are substantial. It makes that, you know, puts more pressure on them, more power for independence just because of their sheer size. The other ones, we talk about some divides. You know, you talk about physical features, the Pyrenees, the river. We could talk about distance between the capital and the core. You could talk about regional differences, such as those natural resources, some separation issues, but even some of them are relatively small compared to some other areas. Again, all of those are acceptable, but by themselves, it's incomplete. You got to tie it back. So if I'm talking about this physical barrier, how does that meet, I guess, make that area want more power, like more voice? And so you got to make sure you're connecting it back. Okay, so here we go. We got a few examples here for D. Take a second, kind of skim through. Okay, so I think this one starts super strong. I mean, look at that explanation and really digging into it. There's a piece though that I think they're missing. Yeah, I think they're missing that. I'm pretending you answered me, by the way. That there's a piece in here that I feel that they're missing that connection back to why, it causes poor communication, absolutely. Thus, this area is going to ask for more representation, more power, more voice. And so devolution, they're going to put some pressure on Spain to give them more of that authority. Now, let's read the next one and see how this one fits. Did you catch it? I think this one really doesn't, if you started skimming, you're like, oh my goodness, the student wrote really, really well. But they do a nice job at the end tying that back. Okay, and that idea that they believe they should have more power to govern over themselves since they are so separate from the rest of Spain anyways. That idea, they're driving it home. Hammer the readers over the head with it. You guys can do this. Okay, one last question about this one. And so this one, we're going to talk about advances in communication technology. Okay, and I think this one students struggled with a little bit, but let's kind of look at a couple examples here. So in Spain, you might talk about, they're an MDC, so their technology and infrastructures, we regularly communicate, you're going to use the internet, you could use social media campaigns to promote independence voice. I mean, good Lord, think about how you guys are communicating lately, right? Think about the memes, um, the social Instagram or TikTok, right? That there's ways to communicate and get people moving now because we're very, very connected. Nigeria, even though it might be more localized due to developing infrastructure, there are areas that it's concentrated, and those areas are going to have more of a voice, correct? And more stability. I mean, even here, I think I've talked to you guys that sometimes our stability of that technology is going to be more, it's going to be stronger in our urban areas than I will tell you, when I go up to my mom and dad's in northern Wisconsin, sometimes it's not great for me, that connectivity. But here, we know that they're going to concentrate those efforts in some of these centralized areas. And so that's going to give them more of a voice to publicize their desire for more independence, more voice. Notice how we're totally connecting it back to facilitating more devolution. And let's be honest, we've talked about this throughout the last X amount of weeks, that we're seeing more access to cell phones across the globe, which means it's easier to transmit some of these ideas. But we know that both, or I should say both, but all three, the Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, using the internet, using social media, have been able to really motivate people to do things and really really cause this idea of kind of that uprising of wanting more voice. So these are some different examples. And so let's take a look at a couple student samples. Okay, and I'll give you a second to read. So I thought this one was pretty solid. I would say if you could talk about why they have more access, that might strengthen it, but they really talk about, even coming back to devolution, right? That we can pressure, we can kind of wage these campaigns. I mean, and think about the world we're living in right now where people are waging campaigns to try and have more voice. Okay, let's look at one more. I think this one is kind of, I just said, that this one in my notes I wrote, I think an example would strengthen this one, to make sure that I understood that they really were thinking about it. I think that they've got the right ideas, an increase in ability to communicate. There's going to be more political alliances, that idea of more voice. But I just felt that there was a little bit of talking to talk. Sometimes I have students do that. And so the more that you can kind of dive in and give an example, it's going to strengthen it. So this might be one that if I was reading with College Board, I'd say, hey, what do you think? Let's talk about this one together. And so that's very common. Adults have to talk to one another, and that is a process that could happen as well. Now, some of you might be going, holy buckets, some of these kids wrote a ton. Sometimes it matters, it's that pre-writing, that thinking. They did follow the same time limits, but at the same time, I would say that they probably had a little bit more time to process those questions, and so they were able to, so some of this might be a little bit false. Don't panic. If you don't get to question E, but you think you nailed A through D, you can still earn a 4 or a 5 on this AP exam, okay? Doesn't mean shortchange yourself anywhere, but don't rush through them. Answer everything as detailed as possible. It doesn't mean you can only answer one question, but honestly, if you got through most of it and you answered them really well, you're still positioning yourself to earn a 4 or 5 on this AP exam. So if you noticed on the second one, we had only one stimulus material and we went down to 4 questions. Time seemed to go a little faster, right? The other things that I noticed when we were taking this too, is that I was so glad that the shorter one was second, because you feel like you've exhausted all of sometimes your energy. But this one I really liked. I would say this one you had to really focus on the regions that this question was asking you to focus on. And you're going to see that one of the students I had do this did not. And so that would not earn any points. I believe would not earn any points. I guess I should make sure I say that. And so what I'd like to do is kind of dig in to each one of these questions, and we'll do kind of the same thing moving forward. Okay, so the first one, this is the only one that I've in this pack where we do compare. And so I do want to spend a little bit, probably more time on this one than the other 3. Compare the predominant ranges of natural increase in Western Europe and Central America. Okay, so we want what's that parallel, what's a potential reason for a difference. And so you want to make sure you're not just pointing out the numbers, okay, which is great, but you got to keep going. And so for example, so the first thing you'd probably do is you'd identify what Western Europe's natural increase rate and Central America's natural increase rate. Okay, and then you'd probably say Western Europe is most likely having fewer births compared to Central America, thus contributing to a natural increase. Okay, but now we need to explain, why is that happening? So there's some reasonable things that we can conclude. We can conclude that Central America's medical and social structure is going to lag behind that of Western Europe. Cultural and economic conditions continue to encourage larger families in Central America. Higher infant and child mortality rates in Central America also encourage higher numbers. And so in contrast, you would say, to that of Western Europe. And then Europe has a higher level of economic development, better healthcare access, and resulting in the need to have, and thus access resulting in the need to have many children. We don't need to have as many kids because we know that in Western Europe that life will sustain itself. So notice though, you're pointing out and you're explaining, by comparing, you're constantly going back and forth. You're not just leaving one hanging. So if I said, I think that first bullet's really clear, but the second and third bullet, notice in the fourth, notice what I did verbally as I connected them back to the other region too. Okay, so let's look at some student samples. I'll give you a second to read here. I like how this student not only identified, but then connected it to the stages of development, and the economic opportunities that are provided there. I would say my one thing is be careful on overgeneralization. It might say it's reasonable to conclude, that idea where it says because they need more to help, bring in income for the family. So it's reasonable to conclude that there's larger families for that, I think is a better phrase. But I would say that overall that there is you can see the nice, we're going to keep going back and forth, and we're kind of comparing and contrasting as you move through there. Okay, this one's a little shorter. So I kind of feel like this one's a little incomplete, and I'm not talking about the length. What I'm talking about, so it's increasing, it talks about more people being born than are dying, but why? Like, I feel like you're kind of, and then example, you're just pointing out Mexico compared to Spain. So again, you're identifying correctly, but you haven't truly compared. All you've done is pointed it out. There's a huge difference, right? And so that's what we want to be. It doesn't say identify, it wants you to then compare. So why is that happening? That's what's missing here. And there is a problem with this last one. I want you to see if you can grab it pretty quick. Let's look at the first sentence. So they went to the wrong region. Okay, and so if you end up in you got to just really make sure you know what they're asking, so that way you have a shot at earning some points. So that one would probably cause them to just move on. Okay, question B. So now we want to talk about changing economic roles for women that have influenced the rate of natural increase in South Asia. So in my head, I always tell my students, first of all, make sure when we talk South Asia, like, what countries should you be thinking? So put those countries in your head. And we know there's been some changing economic roles. So remember, we want to connect. Clearly, you're going to talk about women working, but how does that contribute to, how does that connect to influencing the natural increase? So if we talk education, okay, and you're going to see when we talk about having more education, probably gives people better paying jobs, right? And so if I have a better paying job and more education, it probably means that I've delayed having children. If you delay having less children, that typically means that it's going to impact the natural increase rate. Okay, business ownership. So I was just kind of we were brainstorming here. So in India, in these areas, we've seen a lot of microcredit. We know that there's more capital, in other words, money coming in for women, more career opportunities, for more ownership in their professional life. So first one was really about education and those opportunities. Now we're talking about more of that ownership. And so when women have more voice in their household and able to make their own decisions, then they're able to step up and they probably will limit the number of children. We've seen this, the number of children that they choose to have. And so that will also impact the rate of natural increase. So let's look at some student samples. Okay, so I'll let you skim this one. So I think this one really does a nice job. It gives you your examples. It talks about how it influences the rate of natural increase. It even gives you, for example, in India, you get a higher pay. It's going to delay having children. I mean, it kind of sounds like everything I just said to you, right? But that's because this tends to be one of those major reasons that we see a decrease in rate of natural increase. Okay, so let's look at another one. So this is one that I feel like they really start really strong, and notice it's shorter. I would probably confer with somebody just to make sure, because down at the last sentence, it's trying to close the loop here, right? The rate of natural increase has dropped as women are having less children and providing for more of them having more children and not being able to provide for them. I feel like this person is trying to get there. Like, I feel like they've got the right idea, that I would just but it just got a little bit jumbled, because sometimes when you're writing fast, that's what happens. So I would probably just want to make sure that those that I'm also reading with are also reading it the same way. And then finally, take a look at this one. And so all I said to this one, I said it just really, it's missing the big connection, okay? when women begin to have less children, we'll see that decrease, right? But I feel like they've danced around it. More access and increasing power is going to influence, but how? You're missing that big piece. You're correct, but you gotta spell it out. Don't assume that I know that you know what you're talking about. Okay, this one dances. It's so darn close, and so I would just say spend a little bit more time. Choose your words pretty carefully. Okay, see, we got two more. Explain how the dependency ratio affects the natural increase rate in Eastern Europe. Okay, so typically, if we're looking Europe, are you going to think old age dependency or young dependency? Probably more on that old age, right? But so when we're looking at the dependency ratio, how does that then impact that increase the population, right? And so what we talked a lot about when we look at Eastern Europe, first of all, that natural increase rate is negative 0.5 to 0, right? So we know population is declining here. And so probably based on that, we see an aging population. So the issue then becomes that, right, if we're talking about how does it impact, who's going to care for them, who's going to work, how about that future generation? So but really with the natural increase, the connection too is how does population sustain itself? In other words, if there's fewer children being born to an aging population, the natural increase rate is going to decline. And so what does the future look like? Hopefully that made sense as I was walking you through that. Okay, so let's look at a couple student samples, and this one's really long. So I'm going to let you just spend a second kind of skimming that one. Hopefully you can see in this one as you're kind of skimming is that, they're talking about, they give some example that I don't know if you necessarily need the part where if a couple's already stretched thin by taking care, but what they really get into is that couples are having fewer children, or when you get into the Russia example and they're living longer, it's going to lead to children not having their children not having as many kids. So it's talking about that ripple effect. And so ultimately though, that strain of support. And so that this is going to impact the natural increase rate. So there's probably a little bit in the middle, like you could cut out, make sure you've got kind of what's happening, like how we've got this and how it's impacting that natural increase rate. And so here's one more example. So I think this one is trying to make a plea that there needs to be the natural increase rate needs to grow. And so I think that this one just needs a smidge more development. I feel like this student is really trying to say, listen, based on where this is at, they've got the dependency ratio is out of whack, and we need to maybe look at some incentives to increase this natural, our population. And so this is why it's needed. Here's why it's happened. So I feel like they just needed to close that just a little bit, and they would have it, but they're on the right track. Okay, last question, and then we are going to take a couple things. I've had some of my own students have asked me some questions about kind of the system for next week. So I've pulled a couple slides I wanted to highlight for you. So last question, we're going to talk about population doubling time. And how that is affected by the natural increase rate in Central Africa. Okay, so you want to talk about what is that population doubling time, sorry, and then how does that impact the natural increase rate? Okay, and so when we talk about it, what we're looking at is the rate of natural increase. So if that decreases, the longer it's going to take for population to double. So like when we're just looking at Eastern Europe, right, that's going to take a long time for population to double. In contrast, when I look at Central Africa, we're going to consider that pretty high. In fact, when you see those numbers, 2 to 3%, the 2%, it's going to take 36 years to double. Exponentially, sorry, and then 24 years at that 3%. And so that's going to place pressure on those resources, correct? So that's really how it's going to impact. You want to keep kind of pulling all of those connections together. So here we go. Give you a second to read this one. I do feel like this one is missing. It's really just focusing on kids being born, but I think it's also missing that part of the natural increase rate, though, too, is that people are living longer, and so I feel like this one is missing a little bit here in just focusing on the birth rate. But I do feel that they've done a nice job kind of making those connections and talking about that it's going to take less years than when we compare to France, right? Okay, and so then the last one. Take a second. And I feel like this one is really, they'd really talk about population is growing rapidly and then just making sure, which shows that the rate of natural increase greatly impacts that too is going to rapidly cut down on how many years it's going to take you to double. But I do think they did a nice job kind of connecting it to both of those things. Okay, so that is a really quick overview, and really the big things that we talked about is when you describe, make sure you're talking about those relevant characteristics. When you explain, okay, give an account of those reasons, provide information on how and why that relationship occurs. Use some evidence, some examples, continuously tie it back. And then to compare, give an account of those similarities and differences between two or more items or situations, referring to both of them throughout. Okay, so don't just focus on one, and then make sure you're connecting them. You've got this. I know you can do it. So if you're thinking about what do I do next? Well, first of all, you should tune in tomorrow to listen to practice 2 more questions with Miss Lindsley. But in the meantime, spend some time reviewing your contact information, checking your technology. Hopefully you practice submitting your response. I'll talk about that in a second. Gather anything you think you might need. And then make sure a couple days before you're grabbing your e-ticket. And so reviewing your contact information, you can go into My AP, confirm your email address, just making sure all of that is set up. But I love this down at the bottom. Don't worry. If you still can't get emails from AP, your e-ticket will also be posted in your My AP account. Get into My AP. If you can get into My AP, you can figure everything else out. Okay, so make sure you're getting into there. Second thing, you're going to receive this exam ticket, okay? So you're going to get an email ticket a couple days before each exam. So our test is on Tuesday. But remember, if it's not there, be able to get into My AP, okay? But it is personalized to you. It's not transferable, so don't share it. We're not doing any more exams or late registrations because it's really, this is quite a process. Make sure you save your May e-ticket email in case you need to request a makeup exam. Okay, but again, everything's in My AP as well, so just make sure you're gathering that information. In our folder, that tiny URL that is listed there, this is where those questions were located yesterday. You're also going to find the exam day checklist. So I actually went through this with my son yesterday. We were able to find his 8-character AP ID that he did receive an email, but he just grabbed his from My AP. And so we were just kind of writing stuff down, kind of focusing our mind. But there's other things we talked about. And one of the big things we did talk about is this 4th bullet here. And I'll show you a link in a second, but making sure things are plugged in, which browsers you're going to use, and that we're going to set up our documents correctly. But practicing that AP demo. So I actually walked through it. My son walked me through it. You're not going to need the full 5 minutes, but in case anything goes wrong, 5 minutes is going to give you plenty of time. I would say 2 to 3 is probably what it's going to take if you're having to take a screenshot, and then it might just take you 30 seconds extra instead of copying and pasting. So because he copy and pasted so darn quick, but it's okay. You've got plenty of time to do that. But I highly recommend you practice, because if the first time you're doing it, it could cause some problems. And time is not a reason to ask for a makeup exam. And then during the exam, make sure that you understand that once it's started, you can't refresh your browser or use the back arrow. There's going to be the warning time. When you see that warning, stop working and get it uploaded if you can't figure that out. But make sure you submit before the countdown, and those numbers will be red. They're going to keep you moving. And then if you accidentally close your browser, temporarily lose your internet or experience some other disruption, you're going to click your e-ticket to rejoin. If you can't rejoin, then you'll have to then mark it as, and it marks it as complete, so then you'll have to request a makeup. So really having that checklist, I think, is really handy to kind of walk you through everything you need. And that's in that, should be in that description, those tiny URLs. And so this also, if you come to that last link, this walks you through the 5 steps. So I just highlighted a couple things, but there's a video if I was talking too fast that they've done shortened that for you. There's even kind of some walkthroughs. I mentioned the checklist, but there's plenty of resources out there. Just spend a few minutes kind of prepping and getting yourself organized, and you're going to be great. So I want to thank you for watching today. I know that some of this isn't necessarily always exciting, but I believe that you guys can do this. And I told my producer, I said, I feel like a little Buzz Lightyear today. We are so close. We are almost to infinity and beyond. And I know you can do this. So hopefully you can join Miss Lindsley tomorrow for another set of timed FRQs. Have a great night.